On April 6th, 1998, Tammy Wynette died in her sleep in Nashville, Tennessee. She was 55 years old. George Jones found out the way most people do when someone they once loved dies from someone else, over the phone. He issued a public statement that same day, and buried inside the formal language and the careful words was a sentence that his team probably should have edited out, but didn't, and it said more than he realized. In the end, we were very close friends, and now I have lost that friend, and I couldn't be sadder. That was the version George Jones gave the press. What he said privately, what he admitted in his final years before his own death in 2013, and what their daughter eventually revealed after both of them were gone. That is a different story entirely, and nobody was ready to hear it. Over the next 12 minutes, the full story of George Jones and Tammy Wynette comes into focus, not the version Nashville promoted, not the version either of them gave in public, but the version that came out in fragments over decades. From interviews they gave when they thought fewer people were listening. You'll find out why their divorce had almost nothing to do with falling out of love, and everything to do with a disease that George Jones refused to name for years. You'll hear what Tammy admitted to her daughter 2 weeks before she died, a conversation she'd been holding back for 23 years. And you'll find out what George Jones did on the exact night of the 15th anniversary of Tammy's death, and what he told his wife Nancy when he came off stage for the last time. Two people, one story, and the truth arrived too late for either of them to do anything with it. Long before they found each other, both George Jones and Tammy Wynette had already survived enough heartbreak to fill a catalog. George Jones grew up in Saratoga, Texas, the son of a man who drank heavily and a mother who held the family together through it. And the pattern of watching alcohol reshape a person from the inside was something Jones absorbed so deeply in childhood that it became almost invisible to him when the same thing started happening to himself. His first two marriages came apart. His voice, though, was something that no amount of personal chaos could touch, a pure, aching instrument that made other singers stop and listen. Tammy Wynette came out of poverty in Itawamba County, Mississippi, raised partly by her grandparents after her father died when she was 8 months old, and she arrived in Nashville after 3 failed attempts to get a label to notice her, working as a beautician between trips to Music Row to keep money coming in. By the time she finally broke through in the mid-1960s, she had already been married once and had 3 daughters she was raising largely on her own. When George Jones and Tammy Wynette met in 1968, both of them had already been through enough to know what love was supposed to look like, and that made what happened between them even harder to explain to the outside world later. They married on February the 16th, 1969, and painted the side of a $100,000 tour bus with the words, "Mr. and Mrs. Country Music," which was not quite a joke and not quite a boast, but something that turned out to be exactly true, because for the next 6 years, the two of them together produced a body of recorded work that stood apart from anything either could do alone. The harmony between their voices was not a studio trick, and the audiences who heard it understood that immediately. And none of that was enough to save the marriage, because the thing that was going to destroy it had been there from the beginning. George Jones had been drinking heavily before Tammy Wynette ever met him, and she knew it going in, and she married him anyway, because the version of him she fell in love with was the version that existed when he was sober, which was real, and which was extraordinary, and which kept disappearing. Through the early years of their marriage, the drinking was bad enough, but what turned it into something neither of them could manage came in March of 1977, 2 years after their divorce, when a doctor backstage at a concert injected Jones with liquid cocaine to get him well enough to perform. He had shown up to that show barely functional, and the cocaine put him on stage feeling better than he had in years, and that was the end of any chance he had of finding his way back on his own. What followed was the worst stretch of George Jones's life, and it lasted years, and it wore a nickname that the country music industry eventually turned into a kind of dark joke: No-Show Jones. At his worst, he missed 54 concerts in a single year, 1979. Not because he chose not to go, but because the alcohol and cocaine had taken enough of him that he simply could not function. That same year, he declared bankruptcy, and there were stretches when he was sleeping in his car, and his weight had dropped so far from the drinking that the alcohol had worn holes in his stomach lining, and he vomited every time he tried to eat. Over 200 lawsuits piled up from promoters and venues who had paid deposits for shows that never happened, and audiences who had driven long roads to sit in empty halls. The lawnmower story became famous because Jones himself told it. Tammy had hidden his car keys to keep him from driving drunk to the liquor store, and he climbed onto the riding mower and drove it several miles to buy more alcohol. And when people heard that story later, they laughed. And George laughed too. And underneath the laughter was a man who knew exactly what he had done and carried it for the rest of his life. He let so many people down in those years that the shame of it became its own weight, sitting alongside the addiction rather than replacing it. Tammy Wynette filed for divorce for the first time in 1973, and then again in 1975. And the second time it held. And the reason it held had nothing to do with whether she still loved him. Their daughter Georgette, who was born in 1970 and grew up watching both of her parents from a position nobody would choose, explained it plainly years later. The divorce was not from lack of love, and her mother had hoped that leaving might force George into recovery. Mom and Dad both, even after the divorce, they just didn't want to let go, Georgette said. They still wanted to make it work. What happened next is the part of the story that gets left out of the simple version. They kept working together after the divorce, recording duets, touring occasionally, producing music that somehow captured the exact emotional texture of two people who had loved each other too hard and too badly at the same time. Golden Ring came out in 1976, the year after the divorce was finalized, and it reached #1 on the country charts. And nobody who heard it thought it was a coincidence that the song was about a wedding ring and what it meant when a marriage came apart. George Jones later said they got along better as former spouses than they ever had while married. And there was something true in that, and something unbearable in it at the same time. He also, in the years after the divorce, while keeping 2 or 3 relationships that went nowhere, admitted privately that he wished deep down he could have Tammy back. What he said in public was more careful than that. What he said when he thought fewer people were paying attention was not careful at all. Nancy Sepulvado came into George Jones's life in 1981, when he was at the lowest point anyone who knew him had ever seen. And she did not know who he was when they met. She preferred Creedence Clearwater Revival and the Eagles, and had no particular interest in country music, and that turned out to be exactly what he needed. She married him in 1983 and spent the next 30 years doing something Tammy Wynette had tried to do and couldn't quite manage, which was outlasting the addiction. Jones nearly died in a 1999 car crash near his Franklin, Tennessee home. Multiple fractures, punctured lungs, internal bleeding, an injured liver, and in the hospital. By his own account and Nancy's, he made a vow to God that if he survived, he would never drink again, never smoke again, and be the husband he had failed to be. That was the last time George ever had a cigarette or a drink, Nancy said later, and he was a perfect husband. He was changed. In his 1996 autobiography, I Live to Tell It All, Jones was more honest about the Tammy years than most people expected. Not fully honest, because nobody is fully honest in a memoir written while people who remembered the events are still alive, but honest enough that the picture that came through was recognizable. He admitted the drinking. He admitted the missing shows. he admitted the failures. What he was slower to admit, and what came through more clearly in interviews he gave in his final decade, was how much the end of the marriage with Tammy had genuinely broken something in him that the addiction then got into. He told one interviewer that Tammy would always be his favorite singer. He told another that performing with her in the 1990s, when they reunited for the album One, brought back memories he hadn't been able to access for years. And in the statement he released the day she died in 1998, the sentence that survived the publicist's editing was this: "Life is too short." 3 words. After everything, life is too short. Nobody who had watched the two of them together over 30 years needed to be told what he meant. 2 weeks before Tammy Wynette died, her daughter Georgette drove to Nashville for what was supposed to be a quick visit, a car drop-off. Nothing more, and Tammy woke before dawn to cook breakfast the way she always did when her daughters came home. And then the conversation turned. Georgette described it years later on the Drifting Cowboy podcast, and the detail that stayed with her was how deliberate her mother seemed. Not confused, not nostalgic in a vague way, but specific, like she had been holding something back for a long time and had decided that the time for holding it had passed. "She was just saying that she loved my dad," Georgette recalled. "She always would love my dad, and she hated it wasn't at a time that they could have made it work." Consider what that sentence required of Tammy Wynette to say out loud. 23 years had passed since the divorce. She had been married to George Ritchie for 2 decades. George Jones had been married to Nancy for 15 years. Both of them had built lives that looked, from the outside, like they had moved on. And those lives were real. They were not performances. And still, maybe if it had been different timing when they met and were together, maybe it could have been different, Georgette said. But she would always love him. "I believe my dad was the love of her life." 2 weeks later, Tammy Wynette died in her sleep. She was 55 years old. George Jones survived her by 15 years, long enough to get sober, to become the husband he had promised to be, to stand on stages in his 80s and sing the songs they had made together to audiences that still filled halls to hear them. And on April 6th, 2013, the exact date that marked 15 years since Tammy's death, George Jones walked onto a stage in Knoxville, Tennessee, breathing harder than usual, pausing more than the songs required, sitting down halfway through. Nobody in that audience knew it was the last show he would ever play. But George did. He closed the night with "He Stopped Loving Her Today," the song about a man who only stops loving the woman who left him when he draws his last breath. And then he walked backstage and told Nancy one sentence: "I just did my last show." 20 days later, on April 26th, 2013, George Jones died at 81. Nancy was with him. His last words, she said, sounded like a conversation with God. On April 6th, 1998, Tammy Wynette died. On April 6th, 2013, George Jones gave his last performance, chose "He Stopped Loving Her Today" as the final song, and told his wife the run was over. The anniversary was not a coincidence that anyone who knew him could dismiss. 2 people who sang about heartbreak better than almost anyone who ever lived turned out to be carrying their own quietly in public for decades, and the things they actually felt about each other came out only in fragments, in statements that almost made it past the publicists, in a kitchen conversation at 5 in the morning 2 weeks before one of them was gone. That is the story nobody packaged for you when it was happening. It required distance to see clearly. There's one more detail about the final years of their relationship that we haven't covered yet. Something about what George Jones did the day he found out Tammy had been hospitalized for the last time in 1998, and why that visit became one of the most debated moments in country music history. That story, along with the full account of what George Jones' final decade actually looked like behind the recovery narrative, is what we're covering next. If this story stayed with you, If you believe these are the ones worth telling, subscribe, because there are more of them, and they deserve the same attention.